Please welcome Larry Magid, CEO of ConnectSafely.org, and panelists for CCPA and the Wake of Privacy Legislation in the U.S.
Okay.
Like a director.
Get a little rhythm going. Good morning. Am I on? I think I'm on. Hello, everybody. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and then I'm going to quickly introduce myself, and then we will begin the panel. So, Tom, why don't we start with you?
Good. My name is Tom Pendergast. I'm the Chief Learning Officer with MediaPro, and we're a cybersecurity and privacy training and education company.
I'm Stacey Gray. I'm a privacy attorney in Washington, D.C., and I work for the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit policy shop, and I lead all of our state and federal legislation outreach and analysis efforts.
Perfect. And my name's Thomas Hallett. I lead up the privacy solutions engineering team at OneTrust, which is a privacy management software company.
So I'm Larry Magid. I'm the CEO of ConnectSafely.org, which is a nonprofit internet safety, privacy, and security organization. If my voice sounds familiar, you may hear me on CBS Radio. I'm also the CBS News technology analyst, so I do a lot of radio, often about subjects related to privacy and security. And as long as I have the floor, I'm going to give a brief invitation to everybody here. Next week, I should say February 11th, following Data Privacy Day, will be Safer Internet Day, a global event that's celebrated in 140 countries around the world. And Connect Safely is the U.S. host of the event. And we are having an event at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View during the day, which is largely for high school students. We'll have 300 high school students from around the Bay Area, but we are inviting policy wonks and technology company executives, et cetera. And then we're having an evening event that night, the night of February 11th, at the TikTok offices in Mountain View. It's for parents and children and teens and whoever. I'm not running that event. It's going to be run by teens who are going to be teaching parents how their kids can safely use various apps like TikTok and Snapchat, Instagram, et cetera. So if you're interested in attending either of the event, there are limited seats available. We're filling up. You can go to sid2020.org, and you can read about it, and there is a registration area there. So with that over, let's turn to privacy. And specifically, I want to welcome you to California. How many people are here from out of state? Okay. Well, California is the land of well-meaning legislation with unintended consequences. I know that firsthand because, as I mentioned, I am a technology journalist, and CBS News has turned me in from a freelancer to an employee, which has some benefits and some drawbacks. And the San Jose Mercury News is asking me to form an LLC, which will cost me thousands in fees, legal work, and taxes over the years. So thank you very much, State of California, for protecting my rights and wind up having to cost me a great deal of money and aggravation. I actually liked it the way it was, but they are protecting my rights, I guess. So that's kind of an introduction. I'm not saying that that's also true with CCPA, but inevitably, when you have a piece of legislation that is that broad, it's going to have probably many positive effects, but possibly some negative effects, not only on the companies that are asked to comply, but potentially even on consumers. And that's something I want to explore today. But mostly I want to talk about what the impact is going to be and how companies are complying and where we're going from there. So it's the broadest legislation a U.S. state has ever enacted. It went into effect in January 1st. Starting, I guess, with Tom at the end. Why don't you discuss your understanding of its impact on both businesses and consumers?
Yeah, thank you. One of us will be the other Tom. So this law is going to be a bellwether for all the other states to follow. Well, at least a number of states to follow until they prompt the federal government to do something on their own. But it's also, I think, a pretty clear signal to lawmakers at all the different state levels that they need to be thinking about what they're doing, to businesses across the nation, that if they haven't gotten their data house in order, The time is coming when they need to get their data house in order. And to the consumers who are paying attention, and I think thanks to a lot of the reporting that's been done in the New York Times and Consumer Reports and Washington Post and you name it, there's so much more awareness about privacy laws and the individual's rights. It should also create a groundswell of interest among consumers in seeing things happen in their own state. So for me, it's just an instigator to this happening across the nation.
You know, you mentioned getting their house in order, and that reminds me of a survey that took place last year, which found that 1/3 of executives didn't know what to do in terms of complying with the CCPA. 44% hadn't even heard of it, and half hadn't modified their behavior around GDPR. So do anybody have any updates as to what the current state of readiness is, given the fact that the law went into effect nearly a month ago, and what is being done to make sure that businesses know how to comply? Any of you can take that.
So go ahead, Thomas.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I think obviously the law came into effect, and what the law was really good at was shining that mirror on internal organizations to start, even just starting on the process of getting a house in order. It was mentioned in the talk earlier that although we're 20 months past GDPR, organizations aren't technically meant to be there. They're not fully kind of got everything documented, everything outlined. So although organizations, some of them aren't aware or they haven't changed, it's definitely shining that light on that they need to, and they need to start on that journey. So
Stacey, you're with the Future Privacy Foundation Forum. Can you talk about what educational projects are going on to help businesses better understand the law?
To help businesses better understand the law? Well, I can tell you my perspective on CCPA, which is that I think the sort of lurking secret about CCPA is that despite all of the tremendous compliance costs, which I don't by any means want to invalidate, but the compliance costs associated with a law that isn't quite that well drafted, that people don't quite know what it means, it's not quite interoperable with global standards. Maybe it's a first for small companies to even have to do data mapping at all. Despite all of those costs, it's really not that strong of a law for consumers.
Yeah.
It does like three things. You can access your data, you have a right to a certain degree of transparency, which we all know people don't read privacy policies in the first place, and you have the right to delete the data and request to opt out of sale. And the problem with an opt-out of sale, which is a unique thing in American law, it doesn't exist in other privacy regimes as a standalone thing, is that it sounds good, it's very rhetorically effective, but it doesn't reach a lot of the things that people expect it to reach. It's both over and under-inclusive at the same time. So you have large tech companies like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn even, saying, we're large first-party platforms. We don't sell your data. We have insight maybe into data about you from sort of a wide swath of sources, but we don't sell it to anyone because we're a first party, even while we might be doing personalized advertising and things like that. And then for advertising intermediaries, they are maybe transferring data to service providers that are acting on behalf of both them and the advertisers, both advertisers and publishers, right? So I think people expected an opt-out of sale to be something different than it ended up being. And it ends up, you have companies now, Tom, you can speak better to this, that have an opt-out of sale and opt-out of behavioral advertising, and they're separate.
And even on the behavioral advertising, I think Google is working towards the abolition of tracking cookies, yet it still has the ability within its own advertising network to measure behavior, yet at the same time. And I don't know if anybody can explain that on a technical standpoint, but I find it a little baffling.
So it's a blunt instrument, and I think as soon as it went into effect, people started realizing that we need more. So if anything, it's setting sort of a very low baseline that's nonetheless difficult to comply with for companies. And every law that we've seen introduced since then, the Washington Privacy Act, a lot of the CCPA copycat bills that we see across the country, the California ballot initiative that will be on the ballot this year, this November in 2020, they all go way farther.
You know, it's interesting. I know a lot about the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, and it had a severe impact on a number of smaller companies that couldn't comply, some of which had wonderful children's services that they had to basically drop, yet the larger companies were able to either comply with it or simply just, establish a 13 and up. So, I mean, is there that risk with CCPA of hurting smaller companies and bigger companies doing just fine?
I think there's a risk with any privacy regime that has compliance costs associated with it, that smaller companies are always going to have more challenges with that. I think you can start to solve for that if you're looking at this as a lawmaker by thinking about things like small business exemptions, safe harbor programs, but above all of that, just clear rules. I think what I see from small companies is just give me a very clear rule, even if it cuts off some potential business model or source of revenue. The clarity is a cost-saving measure in itself.
Tom?
So Larry, let's go. I want to go back to your original question, which is why aren't businesses acting more speedily to pull this together? And it goes back to something that Gregory said in the previous panel, which is that the gears of regulation and enforcement, like the gears of history, grind really slowly, right? So we saw the GDPR come out, and everybody thought, oh, we're going to immediately see big fines. It's 2 years now, and we hardly have seen any. The same thing is going to happen with CCPA. It will take a good bit of time before enforcement activities come into play and really start nudging all those companies who've decided that they, maybe wasn't even a conscious decision, but decided they could sit on the sidelines, or maybe they knew they wouldn't be the initial targets of enforcement, and so they could wait. If we think that this change in privacy is going to impact the whole world right away, it's not. It's going to take some time for us to change the entire culture around how businesses approach privacy and how individuals understand the reclamation of privacy rights that laws like this give back to them.
Thomas, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's just an interesting point around how organizations are trying to understand the law and kind of go through it. I speak to a lot of organizations in kind of my role. Everyone's asking the same questions. People are asking, oh, what's everyone else doing in the market? What do I need? How big's the privacy team in all these companies? Like, do I need a cookie banner at all? The unknown is kind of the biggest thing, I think, that's stopping people from starting as well. And it goes back to the legislation's not being quite descriptive enough through them. I still don't think we have a full definition of what the sale of information is. So everyone's understanding it in their own way, and cookies is falling under that banner. So I think education and kind of training and just understanding over time, even the legislators themselves need to get that kind of understanding as well.
So one reason we're talking about CCPA in a national forum is because California is, I think, the world's fifth largest economy. It affects essentially everyone in the United States and really everyone in the world on some level, especially given the presence of all the tech companies here. But another large economy is Europe. And a number of you have mentioned the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, if I had that right. That's also having an impact in California and throughout the United States. Just yesterday, I got probably the 1,000th email from some company to recognize that I had to agree to something to be in compliance with GDPR, even though I have no idea what I agreed to. I clicked on it anyway. I think I gave up all my privacy rights or whatever, not sure. But all I know is that we have these two very large economies with different laws. We have no federal legislation. We have no global legislation. I'm not sure we ever will have global legislation. But let's start by talking about the differences and similarities between GDPR and CCPA.
Yeah, I think I can start with that one. So it's interesting to see as organizations implement measures for CCPA, those that already comply with the GDPR and went through that process a couple of years ago are very much on the front foot to that. So although there are kind of big differences, the amount of rights that consumers have in California is less than European citizens have in kind of Europe as well. But although there are differences, I think as you kind of comply with the likes of the GDPR, it sets you on the front foot to then go through these legislations. And I think we might see that across the rest of the US as well when we start to go through these other laws, is that if you start with that big foundation of maybe the most comprehensive in the terms of the GDPR's got kind of more in it than the CCPA, it helps with these additional laws as well through that.
Any other thoughts about GDPR versus CCPA?
It's true if you've done your GDPR lift, checking the boxes for CCPA should be relatively straightforward. But I think when CCPA came into effect, a lot of people were comparing it to the USA's GDPR. Oh, it's global, it's comprehensive privacy legislation. The two laws could not be more different. I mean, just in scale and in substance, in what they do, the CCPA has a few relatively limited individual rights. The GDPR is comprehensive. It does not rely solely on consent, like the last panelists were just talking about. It has a legitimate interest, lawful basis to collect data. It has lawful bases to collect data at all, which is something the CCPA lacks. It has data protection by design and privacy by design requirements. It has auditing requirements. It has automated decision-making requirements, prohibitions against sensitive data use, prohibitions against automated decision-making using those sensitive categories. So many other things, many of which don't rely on individuals standing up for themselves and exercising their rights. So the laws really couldn't be more different.
And yet one of the problems we face is that there aren't enough privacy professionals in the world to sort out the difference in companies, to sort out the differences between these two big laws and all the other state laws and maybe a federal law that are going to come around. At some point, if we're going to enable global or even interstate commerce effectively, we're going to have to kind of come to some shared principles that enable data to flow across all of the borders that data will flow across.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, but I just want to make an observation that, as I recall, GDPR was negotiated over a period of years, and it was a huge undertaking. As I remember CCPA, it was put together very quickly in response to trying to stave off a referendum. The legislature put together this law in a matter of, I think, days or weeks. It was very, very much more limited in the development than GDPR. But getting back to the point you made, and we've all referenced, it's a patchwork of laws. If you're in Arkansas, do you have different rights than if you're in Oklahoma or California or, for that matter, Paris? And so let's talk about how we can, what the impact of this patchwork is on both businesses and consumers, and what, if anything, can be done about it.
I won't speak for Microsoft, but what I've observed Microsoft do is they build their policies and their practices around the highest global standard, and they behave that way across all of the different domains where they do business, which are probably all of the possible domains in the world. I mean, if I were running a company, that's what I would do too. I would adhere to the highest principles and not attempt to wade through all of the sifting of the various conflicting claims made by these laws. That's a tangential answer to your question, Larry.
Any other thoughts?
So we obviously need a comprehensive federal standard, right? This is what FPF has been among the many calling for a uniform national standard. And I think many of the reasons there get into definitions of key terms, how you define personal information, how you define what it means to properly de-identify information, what it means to transfer information, what it means to sell information. These are the kinds of things where if you have slightly different definitions and structural differences between state laws, you're going to have major problems with your data mapping and compliance across different states. That said, I think the push from industry right now is we want to have a federal law that preempts everything and no states shall regulate on privacy ever again. And that's probably also not going to be totally practical. I want to point out there's a great deal of what I would call sort of legal innovation happening at the state level. States are better positioned to respond quickly, particularly to new technology or in times of a crisis. You saw a lot of this, for example, after the AIDS epidemic, there were HIV disclosure laws passed in a lot of states very quickly to regulate the disclosure of that new sensitive type of information about people. You see state laws related to not allowing employers to demand social media passwords. Pretty unobjectionable, doesn't necessarily conflict with a comprehensive framework, right? So I think we're going to have to find a way to set a uniform national standard and acknowledge the reality that states are always going to have their own slightly different, states have different privacy tort law, for example.
Well, I know there is some federal legislation, I don't know in exactly what fields, which actually preempts state laws, which basically says you must comply with the federal law and the states cannot make it any stronger or any weaker. In fact, there's a debate over emission standards, with the Trump administration wanting California to essentially weaken its laws to be in compliance to what the administration wants to be the federal law. It strikes me that those laws, on one hand, do clarify and create a level playing field and make it easier for companies to do business across the country, but the other hand, they deny state legislators or the people of individual states the opportunity to improve or increase the rights within their state. And how does that work in a privacy world, especially, again, since most of the companies are operating at least throughout the country, if not throughout the world.
That's 100% the heart of the last remaining barriers to having a comprehensive federal law. It's down to two things. How will the law be enforced, which I think is a bit of a more approachable question, even though there are strong political views on each side, and preemption. To what extent should it preempt innovative state measures? The answer is going to be it's going to have to preempt some, and then the harder questions are going to be around things like who is the federal government to tell a state that they can't tell their own law enforcement officers, for example, at the local and state level, that they can't use facial recognition technology?
Yeah, what would happen if North Dakota passed a really, really strong privacy law and nobody else in the country, including the federal government, had that law? Would Facebook and Google and Microsoft and all these large companies, how would they handle it?
Geofence out
few
North
customers
Dakota?
they have in North Dakota.
It's a good question, and it's, I guess, lucky in that sense that we started with a large economy like California. What we're seeing is a lot of states like that trying to pass sectoral laws. So we saw Illinois actually passed, and then it got vetoed by the governor, a geolocation collection, use, and sharing law last year that may come back. And I think with something like that, companies would have had to level up. But the more of these that you start seeing, I mean, we had, 19 bills introduced last year. None of them passed. Well, 2 of them passed and got vetoed by governors, but none of them effectively passed. This year, just in January alone, my count was over 700 privacy bills introduced at the state level related to privacy, data collection, biometrics, AI.
So if anybody's looking for a new career, I think becoming a policy wonk for a company for all states, there must be plenty of jobs open in that area.
And some of them don't necessarily conflict with the comprehensive regimes, right? So one of them that had a hearing this morning in a committee in the state of Washington is called the AI Profiling Act, which is worth taking a look at. It's like 2 pages long. It's totally approachable to read, even if you're not a lawyer. And it deals with public spaces in the state of Washington and whether companies should be permitted to use artificial intelligence through cameras to make decisions about people based on their appearance, not their identity, but things like gender, race, right? So not strictly speaking an identity or a privacy-specific law, but a law about the kinds of protections and the kinds of inferences that people should be able to make about us in public spaces.
Yeah. Tom, you look like you wanted to say something. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think AI is a great example of a technology that even people within the technology world don't fully understand and can't fully agree on what the parameters of it, but is obviously going to have a huge impact on all aspects of society, especially privacy. So I guess let's talk a little bit about the consumer. I mean, we've talked a bit about businesses, and Stacey, you kind of referenced that, consumers are getting some rights under the CCPA, but maybe those rights may not be as meaningful as some people think they are. How do we, first of all, engage consumers to understand that they should be thinking about their privacy rights, get them to understand in a realistic and meaningful way what are privacy threats and what aren't, because a lot of things people are paranoid about turn out to not be true. I constantly hearing people in my family complaining that Google is listening to all of their conversations and is sending them ads based on things they're saying, even if the phone isn't even turned on, which would be a good trick. But yet, at the same time, there may be some major privacy things, risks that we're taking that many of us aren't even aware of. So starting with kind of consumer education and then getting into how do consumers protect their own rights once they understand what they are.
Yeah, I think it's interesting on the education part and also how organizations approach the consumer. So a big thing across Europe when GDPR hit was every single person, every single organization that you never knew had your data sent you an email that said, here's our new privacy statement, please can you accept it? And everyone was kind of, I didn't even realize you had that. So I think the fact that organizations have to have that disclosure, again, tells you, okay, this is where my data is, gives you a bit of that understanding of, I need to consider actually where I put my password in. When that pop-up comes up and says, do you accept to this? Actually, what is that doing? So I think a lot of this legislation has that kind of understanding and those disclosures to put that in front of the consumers.
It reminds me of those signs in every business of California. You walk into any lobby and you're going to see a sign that there are something known to the state of California here that's going to cause cancer, right? So if there really was asbestos falling off the walls, would they have the same sign? How do you know, given the fact that these signs are literally everywhere, what actually is a cancer risk versus what's just a compliance sign. And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
as you bring up this issue, similar with privacy, how do we know? None of us, few of us read all of these privacy. I mentioned yesterday I got a message from some site that I almost never use. I would have spent more time reading their privacy policies than I'm ever going to spend on that site.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's the equivalent of the online version of that sign is the cookie banner. I don't know, has anyone actually clicked into a cookie banner and read what cookies are on that site or even know what a cookie's doing on that site?
Yeah.
A few people, but the majority of people who access your site just see that as a nuisance. Press accept, don't read it, and just continue. I work in privacy, and every time I see a cookie banner, I just press accept and just
We actually had one hand up, which considering this audience, if you were to do this in any other audience, you would probably get no hands. So.
Exactly. So I think the idea is, at least it's there so people who are interested and want to go through it. I think the actual change of people's perception of privacy online is going to be a very unique thing to each person and how they want to interact with it. So I think it's good that at least we've got that there for those people that want to see it and kind of work with that.
Yeah, if you look at that big Pew Research Center study that was done last year, they showed that most people, most Americans in this case, think that privacy is already lost. Corporations already have all their data. Governments already have all their data. That tells me that we've got a lot of work to do in this country if we're going to reclaim the idea that individuals have any control at all. And I actually think that businesses have a huge role to play in that, because as businesses seek to come into compliance with these various laws, they're going to have to educate their employee populations about their roles and responsibilities. And it just so happens that most of those employees are also citizens. So I think there's a way that the way we educate employees in the workplace can start to change those viewpoints. The work of all the reporters, reporting regularly on privacy issues can start to change those viewpoints. It's not going to be that suddenly everybody's going to notice that there's a privacy banner or a cookie banner and they start to read it. Those things, they annoy the heck out of everybody. But I think there will be sustained, and it'll take a long time, but there will be cultural changes that will make people more cognizant of their rights.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, and it's where we're seeing privacy, and it's a big topic that we're kind of talking about as a company, is around it turning into ethics. This is no longer just a legislation thing. It's no longer every state that comes out with a law, we're going to comply with it. It's about the ethics of a company and whether you as a company want to actually go to the levels of Microsoft and comply with that. And we're seeing it even move towards potentially some organization using it as a competitive advantage. So to say, look, we don't even need to consider all these other legislations. We've taken the standpoint as a company that we're going to comply with the hardest standard out there possible. So I think
and your observation about the fact that people have basically come to the conclusion we have no privacy, that creates a sort of a cynicism, which is very counterproductive. I mean, going back to my cancer analogy, I mean, if every single building in California has carcinogens, how do we know when there really is a significant risk versus when the risk is so small that we probably ought to ignore it? And I mean, I think in the privacy field, there are some areas that people are worried about where the actual risk is fairly low. And I often wonder whether there's things that people are not aware of, are not worried about, where the risk is actually much higher. I don't know if anybody has examples of those, but I always think that people have a tendency to worry about the wrong risks and stress over things that are either less severe or far less likely than the things that are more likely to bite them.
The big risk when it comes to privacy is that if we get habituated to giving control of our data away, we will lose the capacity to function effectively in a democracy. I think Julie Brill mentioned something similar to that earlier. But to control your data and to accept that you are in control of your data is to acknowledge that you're a self-determined individual, that who you are matters, and that ultimately you'd like to assert some kind of control over that.
Well, worrying about the demise of our democracy is very fashionable right now, so I'm glad somebody brought that into the conversation.
I think it's nice. I think this is one of the things that, although California Consumer Privacy Act doesn't kind of go all the way, I think that kind of point exactly as you meant, at least it gives you some control. Although it doesn't have many rights in there, one of your rights is to deletion. So you do now have that right to go through, and if you wanted to, every single company send them a request and say, kind of remove my data. And it's interesting to see people are actually doing that. You speak to some organizations, they've had over 2,000 requests within the first week of CCPA going into effect, whereas others have had 2. So it's interesting to see that although there's still a way to go with kind of privacy and getting it involved, at least the first right to delete your data and have that removed is kind of there with that.
So we have just over 5 minutes left, and I do want to open it up for questions and comments from the audience. So feel free to jump in. Oh, yes, sir. If you identify yourself, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Question I have, real quick one.
Mind identifying yourself, sir?
Oh, my name is Paul Starrett. I have a firm. We work in AI.
Unless you want to exert your privacy.
Well, and that's why it's going to be my question, but specifically unstructured data. My question is that given the cost of finding sensitive data for data workflows, things like that, given the volume and complexity of data, I've heard it said that if you don't use AI, you might be substandard. Just wondering if you think that that's true, because it's cheaper, it's faster, and if not, what's the barriers to, just the general idea of that at all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've seen kind of 2 points to that is, firstly, I think privacy has tended more from what was traditionally just technical links. So if you looked at data mapping before kind of privacy regulations, it was very much the IT department saying that here's the link between this system and this system. Whereas what I'm seeing a lot of organizations go through now is really getting the business involved to tell them that information as well. So as you say, if you're going to start doing scanning of all your unstructured data, it's going to take a long time, and things like AI platforms are really going to help you with that. But I also think there's a second piece, which is really getting the business involved as well, which gives you more context. And although not the technical fields that are in your systems, it might bring out some of that information as well. So yeah, I think there's kind of definitely 2 pieces. And obviously things like AI platforms really help with finding data, but also getting the business to tell you where that data is an important piece that I've seen.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes? Nope? All right, well, I'm being told that we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists, Tom, Thomas, and Stacy, and thank the audience. Appreciate your attention.
Thanks, everybody.